Hello, my loves, and welcome back to this one of the last episodes of the Ages of Chaos. We are nearing the end now. We're nearing the present day when it comes to Games Workshop's many manifestations of the powers of chaos. Now, what the era that we're moving into is it's the early AOS and early 8th ed 40k setting, and that's a very nice dovetail because what they try to do with 8th ed 40k is to make it synchronous with AOS. So the gaming system is very similar. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar, and the dynamic of the two games, but also of their universes, are very similar in that, unlike before, where you just had the iterations of the gamings and their universes, and that they were just established, that was what was happening, that was the setting, and this is how things were. The 8th ed 40k and AOS are far more dynamic. They're a far more dynamic system whereby Games Workshop don't have to release new iterations. There doesn't need to be, for example, a 9th ed 40k, although there may be at some point. There doesn't necessarily need to be, because the new system and the new universe, the background, is so dynamic that it doesn't really matter. All they have to do is introduce new campaigns, new updates, new little tweaks and changes that change the setting or that move the story forward a little bit, which they have been doing in recent days with things like the Vigilus campaign and whatever, but that will be a little later on. That is one of the things that changed massively in the shift into AOS and 8th ed 40k is the way they look at chaos. What had happened, as we've explored in previous videos, chaos was still very significant in the background, and probably always will be, because as we discussed in the very first video, chaos is part of what makes these universes special. It's what distinguishes them from other fantasy and horror settings and other fantasy and horror mythologies. It's something a little bit different. It lends these settings a certain metaphysics that they didn't otherwise have. But what had happened over the various different incarnations of both 40k and Fantasy Battle, as it was that chaos had remained consistent and significant in the background, but had waned in the gaming system. In fact, it had become a bit of a joke in the gaming systems up to this point, really. Particularly in 40k, it was a bit of a mess up until the advent of 8th ed. What they did was they took a step back. They took a step back from the traditional incarnations of chaos, and they looked at what the dynamic of this part of the background and the myriad forces that comprise it was going to be in the future. So how are they going to manifest chaos in these universes going forward? And what they decided is, I think, the best way to do it. Because by this point, in the background, the various different forces of chaos. In AOS, you have the forces of the four gods, for example, all of which are strikingly different in the background in terms of their aesthetics and the way they're supposed to play. You've got you've got the mortal armies of chaos, you've got the demonic armies of chaos, you've got the beastmen, you've got the skaven. There are all of these different polyglot aspects of chaos, none of which can be given the appropriate attention in a single all-singing, all-dancing book, as it was in the past. It just doesn't work. It cannot be made to work. The same is true in 40k. Not only do you have the demons, the cult forces, the forces of each of the great powers, you also have the renegades, you have the cultists, you have the other legions, all of which are very different from one another and have never been different enough in the way they manifest in the gaming system. One of the problems that the Chaos Codexes have always had is that there's too much going on, and as a result, something has to suffer. Somebody's army out there has to suffer, and that's really sad. That is really sad. What they've done, what they decided going forward in both AOS and 40k is that this is non-sustainable. It can't work. You cannot have the all-singing, all-dancing army books, neither in terms of the background, because things need to get glossed over in favour of other stuff, but also in terms of the rules, because things just will not get the same degree of attention as other things. So what they decided to do, and I think it's the best decision they ever made, was to break chaos up. So now you have the overarching keyword of chaos that unites certain forces in the same way that the keywords of order and destruction in AOS do, or the Imperium or the Xenos races in 40k do. In AOS, the first indication of that was the Khorne Bloodbound, which we discussed last time, which later became the Disciples of Khorne, which we'll be discussing in a moment. But the first real book that cemented that was one of the best books they ever produced, which is The Disciples of Tzeentch. Now, the Disciples of Tzeentch did for the forces of Tzeentch what the Khorne Bloodbound did for the forces of Khorne. However, what it also did was demonstrated that they were not just going to copy and paste the same type of army between the Chaos Powers. Oh, no, 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 no. Whereas the Khorne Bloodbound were very much like your classic Chaos Warrior army from the fantasy battle setting. They were comprised of these tribes people and of big, massively enhanced chaos-suffused Chaos Warriors and cavalry. That's what they used to... They very much reflected Chaos armies as they were, and as they classically have always been in that regard, and they still do. That's what the Khorne forces are in AOS. If you want to go for the classic Chaos army, you go for one of the Khorne armies. The Disciples of Tzeentch changed all of that. They changed all of that, both in terms of the background and in terms of the way the armies work and the way they function in the game. So, whereas the forces of the Khorne Bloodbound are tribespeople, they're often nomadic, they don't have one particular setting, the forces of Tzeentch are far more subtle. And they operate within civilizations. They are not outside of civilization, they're actually part of it, and that's how they function. They are this insidious rot that sets in and that permeates every aspect of culture and civilization and then corrodes it from within. So the Disciples of Tzeentch are not slathering hordes of Chaos Warriors. They emphasize more the cultist aspect of chaos. So they derive from things like secret societies and from artistic and philosophical movements, from revolutionary movements. Often, the Disciples of Tzeentch don't even know that they are serving Tzeentch, or that their movement is dedicated to one of the Chaos Powers, and often it isn't. It's much more subtle than that. It doesn't become overt or apparent until they actually erupt. They're much more like the Gene Stealer cults from 40k. That's how they operate. So you get these very you can get entire civilizations in the mortal realms that are undermined by the influence of Tzeentch, and combined with that, you have the various legions of Tzeentch's demonic forces, all of which get much more detail in this book than they ever had before. So you get this notion of there being circles or cohorts of Tzeentch's demons, all of which emphasize differing aspects of the Changer of Ways himself. So suddenly, you have this incredibly stylized book that is artistically very, very, very experimental, very different from anything that has come before, and much more varied. It actually, in terms of its art style and the way it's set out, it much more reflects the old Realms of Chaos books than anything, but a bit more ordered, a bit more easy to understand. But you also have this wonderful shift in dynamic. There's never been a Chaos force at this point like the Disciples of Tzeentch, in terms of either the background or the way they play. Never before. It's a fascinating book, and because a lot of it is so new, because we've never seen this aspect of Chaos before, it's fascinating to read. It is absolutely fascinating. The book goes into extreme detail about how these cults operate, how they first establish themselves, and then how they go about recruiting new members, how they conceal themselves, how they use subterfuge and misdirection in order to conceal what they're actually doing. It's absolutely brilliant and far more legitimately Tzeentchian than anything that has ever gone in any Chaos book before. It's a brilliant way of characterizing these particular forces, and it works so well. It's a wonderful book, and I urge you to go out there and just read it. Although, ladies and gents, it may be worth waiting, because I have a funny feeling that there's going to be a new iteration of it very, very soon. On the heels of that, we also had the Blades of Khorne book. And now the Blades of Khorne is it's a new adaptation of the Khorne Bloodbound. So it incorporates all the same elements, it has the same background, but it tries to update the Khorne Bloodbound a little bit. It gives them a lot more. And of course there is now a new book of the Khorne Bloodbound coming out, which we'll discuss when it actually comes out. But what the Disciples of Khorne does, the Blades of Khorne does, is try to introduce dynamic elements that are similar to those that are in the Disciples of Tzeentch book, but for Khorne. So, whereas, of course, the Disciples of Tzeentch are massively magic heavy, in fact, they're one of the most magically dominant powers in the entire AOS setting. The entire setting. The Khorne Bloodbound are obviously close combat oriented, but they have this wonderful dynamic that's borrowed from the old Demonkin of Khorne 40k book, i.e. they have the Blood Tithe table, which is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful way of characterizing this army. So, it's the same basic dynamic. As the Blades of Khorne kill enemy units or are killed themselves, they gain Blood Tithe points, which they can then spend on various effects in-game, which makes a lot of sense because AOS being as magic heavy as it is, and it really is, it relies a lot on magic. The Khorne forces are ostensibly on the hot foot because they don't have any wizards, they don't have any sorcerers, they despise magic. So instead they have the priests with the various different incarnations of priests with their various prayers and miracles and whatnot. And they also have the Blood Tithe table, which gives them a little bit of an advantage, but also a little bit of character. And the book just takes the time to update certain things and to tweak certain things. The background is largely the same, which is fine, because the Khorne background is very, very, very good in the AOS setting. It doesn't really need tweaking very much. It's a wonderful, wonderful piece of work. Later on, you got the Maggotkin of Nurgle, which is, again, it does for Nurgle what these previous books did for Khorne and Tzeentch. So the Maggotkin of Nurgle are once again a very, 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 very different army from all of the other Chaos forces. They comprise primarily really small units. They are very heavily elite, very, very small, powerful units that are massively difficult to shift. You also have this wonderful notion that the Disciples of Tzeentch have a sort of army-wide special rule based on fate dice. It's actually literally based on fate, which is brilliant. So basically what you do before the battle, you roll a certain number of dice, and you can then, throughout the battle, exchange particular dice rolls for one of those rolls, if you want to. So you can change the course of fate. It's a brilliant, wonderful dynamic for a Tzeentch force. In the Khorne Bloodbound, you have, or rather the Blades of Khorne, you have the Blood Tithe table. In the Maggotkin of Nurgle, you have this cycle. You have the cycles of Nurgle. So it's a randomized cycle, basically. So it's like it's a circle of different stages, and you can either randomly determine on what stage the cycle starts at the beginning of the battle, or you can just choose one. And every battle round, that cycle moves on. And every different point that it lands on gives the Nurgle armies a different special rule. It's really bloody clever. It characterises the Maggotkin of Nurgle so beautifully, and it gives them this real dynamic feeling, which is something that they've tried to do for all the forces in AOS. Again, in terms of background, there is this real wonderful feeling to the Maggotkin of Nurgle. This incredible sense of character where they are dynamically very, very, very different from both the Blades of Khorne and the Disciples of Tzeentch. Like the Blades of Khorne, they tend to be nomadic. They don't tend to have like a home or cities or anything like that. They tend to operate in the more rural or wilder areas of the mortal realms, and their impetus largely is to spread their master's blessings. That's what they're trying to do. They are very much like the Nurgle forces of old. They're garrulous, they are quite fun. They want to bring their father's realm and his generosity to the realms, and that's what it's about. It's about spreading the garden of Nurgle. It's about sowing the seeds for the garden of Nurgle, and it works really bloody well. It is definitely the way that it should have been done a long time ago, because it means that they can focus down. There is so much in these books that is very specific to these chaos powers, and it lends them much more in the way of intrigue, much more in the way of new stuff. They can put new stuff into this background in ways that they couldn't before, in ways that they were hampered with before, that they've probably been trying to do for years and years, and that's a real shame. And that's kind of where we are with chaos in AOS at the moment. There are other chaos forces as well. There are things I will discuss in the next video, things like the Skaven, which are now a chaos force, the Beast Men, which are also a chaos force. Looking forward, what's very clear is that since we've already had the Wrath portion of the Chaos Forces, we're going to get the Rapture later this year, and I think it's fair to say that we're probably going to get a Slaanesh battle tome within the year, and that, I'm just fascinated. Slaanesh is my favourite of the Chaos powers and always has been, and I am absolutely fascinated to see what new dynamic they bring, to see how they characterise the Slaanesh forces in the Mortal Realms. What are they doing? My guess is they're going to be, in the same way that the Nurgle forces are dynamically kind of similar to the Khorne forces, I imagine the Slaanesh forces will be more like the Tzeentch forces. They'll be more ingrained within civilizations. They'll be more based within cults and movements rather than vast slathering hordes of warriors or whatever. That would be my guess, but we'll have to see. It will be fascinating to see what they do and how they use that as an excuse to move everything forward, which they will. Of course they will. My guess is Slaanesh will be unleashed. My guess is that when the new book hits, that's when Slaanesh is going to make his grand appearance back onto the stage of the Mortal Realms. Meanwhile, over in 40k, we'd had the release of the Chaos Codex, which was very, very bloody good. The Codex Chaos Space Marines was very bloody good, but was very much a stopgap. That much is very clear now. What they've done in the time since is they've tried to break up the Chaos Forces to make them way more dynamic so they can actually focus on specific armies. The first example of that was the frankly sublime Death Guard book. The Death Guard book in 40k, the first Death Guard Codex, which was synonymous with an entire Nurgle release. You had such brilliant miniatures in that range. You've got new Plague Marines, two different types of Chaos Terminators, the Death Shroud and the what are they called? The Blight Lords. You had new Nurgle cultists in the form of the Poxwalkers. You had an entire range of new characters, all of whom are different operatives or officials within, or sanctified figures within the Death Guard hierarchy. So you had tallymen who were kind of like chaplains. You had oh, what are they called? The weird guy with the churn in his belly that can spray effluent all over his victims. Just wonderful, wonderful, wonderful characters. You had the plague surgeons. You also had Mortarion himself, of course. Mortarion himself, the second demon Primarch to be unleashed upon the world, and by God is that miniature amazing. I mean, it captures so much about the Death Lord. It captures so much about him, and tells so much of his story in just by certain felicities in the design. It is sublime. But the Death Guard book was a new take on chaos in the 40k universe. It demonstrated what they were looking for and what they're going to do moving forward. So in the Death Guard Codex, you suddenly have more background on Nurgle and the Death Guard than you've ever had before. You suddenly have details on how they operate philosophically, how they're organized, why they wage war, what they do, how they feel, how the different cohorts and subcults operate, and why these different characters exist within their hierarchy. It's not just the details of how they work as an army, it's how they work domestically. And that works really well for the Death Guard because they do have this very heavy domestic element, as befits servants of Nurgle, because Nurgle is a very domestic god. And it's how they operate in relation to things like the Nurgle demons and to Nurgle himself, what their relationship is. It goes into the most lurid, disgusting detail. For me, some of the best elements of it is where it talks about the plague planet, where they come from, where they made their home, and how it functions, how it kind of resembles Barbarous, where Mortarion was raised, and how they operate politically on that world. It is a stunning read. Even if you don't collect Death Guard, it is just a beautiful book to pick up and read because it's fun. And it's exactly what Chaos players have been clamouring for. It is exactly what we've always wanted. It is beautiful. Next to that, we also had The Thousand Sons. Now, the Thousand Sons release, since they'd already had a bit of a resurrection, wasn't quite as fulsome as the Death Guard release. They didn't have the unique demon engines or anything like that, which I feel they probably will when they're redone. But it's still a bloody excellent codex. Once again, you get this hyper detail on how not only on how the Thousand Sons have traditionally operated and where they come from, but you also get how they're operating now. So what is their current status in the 40k universe now that the Cicatrix Maledictum has opened, now that Sorciarius has moved from the warp out into the material universe? What is going on with Ahriman and his cabal? What is going on with Magnus the Red? How are the various different subcults of the Thousand Sons operating in relation to one another? It is absolutely sublime. It's a beautiful book. Not only is it a beautiful book, but for the first fucking time ever, ladies and gentlemen, the Thousand Sons are brilliant. They're still, I mean, even now they're a great army, and it's kind of an old codex now, so it is a little bit creaky around the edges. It's nowhere near as good as ones like, say, the Drukhari Codex or anything like that, but it's still an absolutely sublime codex because the Thousand Sons operate as they should at long last, and they are viable. As an army, they are beautifully viable. I'm a Thousand Sons player. Zeech is my second favourite Chaos Force, and I love the Thousand Sons. I've always loved the Thousand Sons. So for me, this codex is a blessing. It's an absolute blessing. To sort of fill in the gaps in the miniatures range and in the army list, what they did was seconded a lot of stuff from the AOS range. So you've got Zarngor, for example. You've got Zarngor Shamans and Skyfires, which are brilliant in 40k. You've got the Mutilath Vortex Beast, which is a really interesting sort of buffing dynamic. But most of all, you've got Thousand Sons units that are viable, that actually work as they should, and I'm so happy about that. The army relies on its sorcerers, which is the way it should do. And not only that, the sorcerers are good at long last. The sorcerers in the Thousand Sons Codex give the Eldar or the Eldaria a run for their money. They are absolutely sublime. They have access to such a wide range of spells and powers, and that's the way it should be. I cannot tell you how happy I am with this book. I really cannot tell you. It's a beautiful, beautiful tome. But one of the things I love it does in background terms is that it establishes just how far removed the Thousand Sons are, not only from their contemporaries in the other Chaos forces, but from every other force in the universe. There are little quotes and little bits of background that describe how the Thousand Sons view the universe in a very strange way because of their natures, because of their sorcerous natures. They perceive things outside of linear time. They don't perceive things in terms of cause and effect. So there are quotes, for example, from Thousand Sons sorcerers in the book where they're talking about how before the heresy, before their fall from grace, they remember talking to themselves, or what ultimately turned out to be a future incarnation of themselves that was manipulating them from afar to bring about the fall. There's these wonderful paradoxes going on, which suits Zeech down to the ground. It works so well. It does for the Thousand Sons what the Death Guard book does for the Death Guard. It is sublime, and I cannot wait to see what they do when they update the army list, because for my money, the only thing it's missing are unique demon engines. It needs a few like Zeechian demon engines. It needs things like some flying demon engines would be nice beyond the Helldrake. Something like the Silver Towers. That would be wonderful. An actual Silver Tower would be absolutely sublime. But beyond that, the book is great. The book is one of the best Chaos books out there for my money. I absolutely love it. And that's where we are now. That's kind of where we are now in 40k. Chaos has been a bit quiet for a while, as other armies have sort of come about and had their spots in the limelight, but that is changing, as we all know, with the Vigilus campaign and with certain recent revelations. In the next video, which is probably going to be the last one, sad to say, we'll take a look at the Beastmen and the Skaven, in AOS, and we'll take a look at Vigilus, the Black Legion, the Resurrection of the War Master, and what will potentially come in the future. And that will be it for the Ages of Chaos, I do feel. So, until then, ladies and gents, bye-bye!